My name is Thomas Whitfield. I am 71 years old. For 34 years, I sat on the federal bench and watched human nature at its worst. I watched men in expensive suits lie without blinking. I watched families tear themselves apart over money. I watched people who claimed to love each other do things that would make a stranger weep. I thought I had seen everything. Then, 5 months ago, I started watching my own son. Last Friday evening, at the private event hall where my wife and I were celebrating our 45th wedding anniversary, my son finally made his move. 150 people were in that room. Old colleagues from the courthouse, law school friends I hadn't seen in decades, neighbors who had watched my children grow up in our front yard. They came to celebrate 45 years of marriage. What they witnessed instead was the unraveling of a scheme that had been building for the better part of a year. Before I tell you what happened that night, I want to ask you something. Drop your location in the comments. I'm always curious where people are watching from. And if you think that a man who spent 3.5 decades reading people for a living can be fooled by his own son, stick around. You might be surprised. The event hall was on the lake, about 20 minutes outside of the city. My wife, Margaret, had picked it herself. She loves the water, always has. She was wearing a pale blue dress that matched her eyes, and when I saw her walking toward me that evening, I thought, not for the first time in 45 years, that I had done nothing in my life to deserve her. The room smelled like gardenias. The tables had white linen and candles, and little framed photographs from different decades of our marriage. Someone had found our wedding photo, and blown it up, and placed it near the entrance. 1,979. Margaret was 24. I was 26. We looked terrified and thrilled, in equal measure. My son David was already there when we arrived. He was standing near the bar with his wife Renee. They were both dressed impeccably. Renee had her hand on David's arm, and she was smiling the way she always smiled at gatherings, wide and deliberate, like a smile she had practiced in a mirror. My son looked nervous. I had learned over the previous months to read his nervousness differently than I used to. I watched him cross the room to greet us. He hugged his mother first, then he shook my hand. His grip was firm. He looked me in the eye. He said, "Dad, this place looks incredible. You deserve this." I said, "Thank you, son." I meant it about 30% of the way. The evening moved the way these evenings do. Cocktail hour, conversation, old friends pulling me into corners to tell stories I had heard before and was glad to hear again. My old law clerk, Marcus, was there with his wife. My former colleague, Judge Patricia Hollenbeck, flew in from Denver. My medical school roommate, Carl, who became a cardiologist and never let me forget it, was at a table near the window telling someone a story that involved both hands and increasingly dramatic sound effects. I kept an eye on David. He was working the room too, talking, laughing, refilling his wine glass twice. At a certain point in the evening, I watched him excuse himself from a conversation near the east wall and move toward the serving table where the champagne had been laid out for the toast. He stood there for a moment. His back was to the room. His wife was 20 feet away, laughing with someone from the catering staff, angled so that she could see what her husband was doing, while appearing not to watch at all. David's right hand moved to the inside pocket of his jacket. He withdrew something small. His body blocked most of the movement. But I was standing at an angle he had not accounted for, and I saw it clearly. A small capsule, the kind that splits open, disappearing into the champagne flute that had been set aside at the far right of the tray. The one closest to the wall. The one I would reach for first if I were standing where they expected me to stand. He straightened up. He adjusted his jacket. He picked up his own glass from the table beside him and walked back toward his wife. I watched him whisper something to her. She nodded once without looking at him. I excused myself from the conversation I was in and walked to the far side of the room, where my old friend Gerald Patterson was standing alone for a moment, looking out at the lake. Gerald is 75. He retired from federal law enforcement 3 years before I left the bench. We have known each other for 40 years. He is the godfather of my youngest daughter. He had been in that room for a reason beyond the anniversary. I leaned close to him and said quietly, "It's tonight." He said, "I know, I saw it. We had planned for this." The next part took less than 90 seconds. Gerald walked to the microphone near the band and asked for everyone's attention. He said he wanted to say a few words about Margaret before the official toast. He had known us for 40 years, he said, and there were things people in this room did not know about how we met, and he intended to fix that before the night was over. Margaret laughed and covered her face with one hand. The room laughed with her. Every eye moved toward Gerald, every eye except mine. I walked to the champagne table. I picked up the flute on the far right, the one David had prepared. I moved it 2 positions to the left. I picked up a clean glass and held it in my right hand. I walked back to where I had been standing before, next to my daughter-in-law Sandra, who was visiting from Seattle and had no part in any of this. Gerald told the story about how Margaret and I met at a bar association dinner in the fall of 1978. He told it beautifully. The room was warm and attentive. David came forward for the toast. He lifted the glass he believed was meant for me, the one on the far right, the one he had prepared. He handed it to me with both hands. He said, "Dad, I had this bottle brought in specially. It's from a vineyard in Sonoma that you mentioned years ago. I always remembered." I looked at the glass. I looked at my son. I said, "That's thoughtful, David. You always did pay attention." I raised the glass along with everyone else when the toast was called. I held it to my lips without drinking. I watched over the rim as my son, who had taken back the glass I had moved to his position, drank from it with the confident ease of a man who believed he had already won. Gerald finished the toast. The room drank. I set my untouched glass on the table behind me. 22 minutes later, my son began to sweat. It started subtly. He touched his forehead twice in the span of 5 minutes. His wife noticed and put her hand on his arm. He said something to her. She guided him toward a chair near the wall. Then his knees buckled and he sat down hard, and his wife called his name, and several people nearby turned to look, and someone said, "Is he all right?" And someone else said, "He doesn't look well." And then my son listed sideways in the chair, and his wife screamed, and the room shifted from celebration to alarm in the span of about 4 seconds. I was already moving toward him when the paramedics were called. I crouched down in front of my son. His eyes were glassy. His words were slow and thick. He looked at me with an expression I had not expected. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something I can only describe as confusion. Not the confusion of a man who has been drugged, but the confusion of a man who cannot understand what has gone wrong with a plan he believed was perfect. I took his hand. I said, "I've got you." He said, "Dad," that was all. Margaret was beside me. She was frightened. She asked me what was happening. I told her I didn't know yet, which was true in the narrow sense of the word. I knew exactly what the substance was. I did not yet know how much of it he had taken or how his body would respond. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. David was loaded onto a stretcher while Renee walked alongside holding his hand and speaking to him in a low, urgent voice. I watched her face carefully. She was frightened, yes, but underneath the fear was something else. A calculation. I had seen that expression in courtrooms for 3 decades, and I recognized it the way you recognize a sound you heard once in your childhood, years later, in an entirely different context. I knew that look. It was the look of someone recalculating. I know this hospital. I retired from the federal bench, not from the world, and this city is my city. I knew the attending physician on call that night. I knew the head of neurology. When we arrived in the emergency room, the nurses recognized me, not as a former patient, but as a former presence, a name they had heard attached to cases over the years. I did not trade on that. I simply waited, the way I have always waited, with more patience than most people expected. Renee was pacing in the waiting area. She was on her phone twice. The second call, she walked as far away from me as the space allowed and kept her voice low. I watched her without appearing to watch her. The physician who came to speak to us was young, early 30s, precise in the way young physicians often are when they are about to deliver news that makes them uncomfortable. He said David was stable. They had treated him and were monitoring his vitals. He would be fine. Then he said, "There is something I need to share with you." His blood work came back with a significant concentration of a sedative compound. This was not consistent with anything David told the paramedics he had consumed voluntarily. "We are required to notify law enforcement when we see this," Renee said. "What does that mean?" The physician said, "It means someone put something in his drink." The room went very quiet. My wife turned to look at me. I met her eyes. I had been protecting her from this for 5 months, and I had not done a perfect job of it. She was not entirely surprised. She was hurt, in the deep, quiet way she gets hurt, and I knew there were conversations ahead that would take time and care and honesty. The detective who arrived 40 minutes later was a woman named Sandra Torres. She was in her late 40s, with close-cropped hair and the particular stillness of someone who had learned, over many years, that silence makes people talk. She interviewed each of us separately in a family consultation room the hospital staff made available. When it was my turn, she sat across from me with a notepad and a pen, and she said, "Mr. Whitfield, I understand you're a retired federal judge." I said, "That's right." She said, "Can you tell me what you know about what happened tonight?" I said, "I can tell you quite a bit. I hope you have time." She looked at me steadily. She said, "I have all the time you need." So I told her. I told her all of it, from the beginning, 5 months back. From the evening in February when I first understood that something in my house had changed in a way I could not ignore. My son David is 43 years old. He is my only son. He has a younger sister, Catherine, who lives in Seattle, and is, as far as I know, the same person she has always been. David was never easy, not even as a child. He was smart and restless, and he needed things to be moving, always building toward the next thing. He worked in commercial real estate development for most of his adult life. He was good at it for a while. Then he wasn't. His wife Renee came from money, or so she had always implied. They had a house in a suburb north of the city, large and well-furnished, and they entertained frequently and talked about investments and second homes and private school options for their children in the distant future. I never examined their finances closely. I trusted my son. In February, I started noticing things. It began with the questions. "Dad, have you thought seriously about your estate structure? Dad, a trust arrangement might not be the most efficient vehicle for assets at your level. Dad, Margaret is wonderful, but she doesn't have the financial background to manage something complex, does she? You should really think about who you'd want making decisions if something happened to you cognitively. You're 71. Have you had a neurological baseline done recently? A lot of men your age start showing early markers and don't even know it." I listened to these questions without answering them directly. I filed them away. Then came the dinner party in March. David and Renee hosted a dinner for 8 people at their home. One of the guests was introduced to me as Dr. Alan Morse, described as an old friend of Renee's family, a psychiatrist who specialized in cognitive health in older adults. Over the course of the meal, this Dr. Morse asked me a series of questions so practiced in their casualness that only someone trained to recognize structured inquiry would have caught it. He asked whether I ever lost track of conversations mid-sentence. He asked whether I found myself repeating stories. He asked whether I had ever driven somewhere familiar and felt briefly uncertain of where I was. I answered honestly and moderately. I am 71. Some of those things happen sometimes. They happen to people of 40. Dr. Morse nodded with the particular gravity of someone preparing a conclusion he had already reached. He suggested very gently that I might benefit from a formal cognitive evaluation, just for baseline purposes, just to know where I stood. He had a clinic, he said. Very discreet. He would be happy to arrange it. I said I would think about it. That night I went home and I did not sleep. I have spent 34 years on the federal bench. I have presided over fraud cases, conspiracy cases, elder financial abuse cases. I know what a setup looks like. I know the shape of it, the particular pacing, the choreography of seemingly casual encounters designed to produce a predetermined outcome. What I had just experienced at my son's dinner table had the structure of a scheme I had sentenced men for 3 times in my career. The next morning I made calls. The first was to a man named Frank Okafor. Frank spent 22 years with the Secret Service before going private. He is expensive, thorough, and discreet. I had referred clients to him from the bench on several occasions when private investigation was relevant to a case. He is someone I trusted completely. I told Frank I needed him to find out everything he could about a man named Alan Morse, who claimed to be a psychiatrist specializing in geriatric cognitive health. Frank called me back in 36 hours. Dr. Alan Morse had a medical license that had been suspended in 2 states. The suspensions were related to falsified competency evaluations, specifically evaluations of elderly patients from wealthy families. In 3 documented cases, patients he declared cognitively incompetent had subsequently been placed under the legal guardianship of family members, who then made significant financial decisions on their behalf. In 2 of those cases, the patients died in care facilities within 18 months of the guardianship filing. The estates were substantially diminished by the time the remaining family members sought legal review. There was a 4th case. It was still open. A 74-year-old retired engineer named Walter Briggs had been declared incompetent by Dr. Morse 8 months prior. His son-in-law had filed for guardianship. Walter was currently living in an assisted living facility 40 miles from his home. His wife had died before any of this began. There was no one fighting for him. I read Frank's report twice. Then I sat in my study for a long time, looking out the window at the yard where my children had grown up, at the tire swing that had been hanging from the oak tree for so many years that the rope had calcified into the bark, and I tried to feel whatever a man is supposed to feel when he learns that his son has aligned himself with people who make their living destroying the elderly. What I felt was cold, precise, purposeful. The same thing I felt 30 years ago when a particularly complex case came across my desk, and I understood in the first reading exactly what had happened and what needed to be done about it. I hired Frank full-time for the investigation. I told my wife I was working on a case review with an old colleague. This was the only lie I told her during those 5 months, and it was the one I am least at peace with, though I believe it was necessary. What Frank found over the following weeks was methodical and devastating. My son's financial situation was significantly worse than I had known. The real estate development company he had been running for 6 years was not in fact a functioning business. It was a vehicle for debt, carrying approximately $800,000 in liabilities against almost no active revenue. He had taken out a second mortgage on his house without telling Renee, or so the bank records suggested. He had liquidated a substantial portion of a retirement account 18 months earlier, and used the proceeds to cover short-term obligations that had since generated new obligations. Renee's family money, as it turned out, was largely a story. Her parents were comfortable, but not wealthy. The image of financial ease that she and David had maintained for years was constructed largely from credit and performance. Frank found the connection between Renee and Alan Morse. He was not merely an old family friend, he was her uncle on her mother's side. They had worked together before. In 2 of the prior cases involving falsified competency evaluations, Renee had been present in some capacity, once as a character reference for the petitioning family member, once as a direct witness in the guardianship filing. This was not opportunism. This was a practiced operation. The scheme worked as follows. Identify an elderly person of significant means. Establish a relationship of trust and proximity. Introduce cognitive concerns gradually, through casual questions and planted seeds of doubt, until the target and those around him begin to accept a narrative of decline. Bring in Alan Morse for an evaluation timed to capture the target on a bad day, or on a day made worse by something administered in advance. File for guardianship on the basis of the evaluation, citing the target's inability to manage his own affairs. Once guardianship was established, the petitioning family member held legal authority over financial decisions. Assets could be moved, sold, or redirected. The process was slow enough to appear legitimate and fast enough that by the time anyone examined it closely, the money was gone. What they needed from me was a guardianship filing that bypassed my wife. Frank found the document in David's home files during a court-authorized review. It was an advance directive, purportedly signed by me, dated 6 years prior, designating David as my primary healthcare and financial decision-maker in the event of incapacity. It named Margaret as secondary, contingent on David's refusal. The signature was forged. I have looked at my own signature on documents for 50 years. A forensic examiner later confirmed what I already knew. I continued presenting as normal. I attended Sunday dinners. I accepted David's questions about estate planning with the mildness of a man who was considering them. I let Alan Morse's clinic call my office twice without returning the calls, which, I was told later, created some urgency in their timeline. I spent a week in early April flying to 2 of the cities where the prior victims had lived. I spoke to adult children of the affected patients, to attorneys who had tried and failed to unwind the guardianship orders, to a woman whose father had been declared incompetent by Alan Morse and had spent the last 14 months of his life in a room he did not recognize. She cried for most of our conversation. I took notes. I gave her Frank's number. In May, I spoke with a federal investigator named Sandra Torres, who, as it turned out, had been building a case against Alan Morse for 7 months. She had 2 of the prior cases documented. She needed one more clear, current, prosecutable instance to move. I told her what I had. She listened with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting for a particular piece to arrive. When I finished, she said, "Mr. Whitfield, are you willing to let this proceed to its natural conclusion?" I said, "Detective, I built my career on due process. Let's do this correctly." The anniversary party was Margaret's idea in the sense that she had always wanted to celebrate 45 years properly. It was my idea in the sense that I suggested the venue, the date, and the guest list. I invited 150 people, including a federal investigator posing as a former court reporter, 2 of Frank's associates positioned as catering staff, and Gerald Patterson, who agreed without hesitation when I explained what was needed. I knew David would move at the party. The timeline was accelerating. His debt situation was becoming critical. He had called Alan Morse's clinic himself in April, I learned later from Torres, to push the evaluation forward. The anniversary party offered what he needed, a large audience to witness what he intended to present as a sudden and alarming deterioration, a public scene that would support an emergency guardianship filing the following Monday. He had arranged for Alan Morse to be on call that night. Morse was to arrive at the hospital after David called him, conduct a brief bedside assessment of me in my allegedly impaired state, and sign an emergency evaluation form that Torres's team had been aware of for 3 weeks. What David did not know was that the substance he had obtained, a fast-acting sedative compound designed to produce confusion and motor impairment within 30 minutes, had been identified by Torres's lab from a partial sample. Frank had retrieved from a contact David had used to source it. We knew what it was. We knew the dose range. We knew that the quantity David had prepared for my champagne flute was enough to produce visible impairment, but not enough to cause serious harm in a healthy adult. We also knew that the same quantity, administered to a man who had consumed 2 glasses of wine and whose body weight was roughly 30 pounds less than mine, would produce a more significant effect. I had not planned for David to drink it. I want to be clear about that. My intention was simply to neutralize the prepared glass and ensure nothing entered my body. The switch of positions on the champagne table was a precaution, not a trap. What David chose to pick up was his decision. After the detective interviewed each of us at the hospital, she stepped out of the consultation room for 12 minutes. When she came back, she was accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and a man in a dark suit I recognized as one of Torres's federal colleagues. Renee was arrested in the waiting area. She stood very still when the officer began reading her rights, the way certain people go still when they finally understand that the thing they feared most has arrived. She did not look at me. She did not look at anyone. She looked at the middle distance, recalculating, always recalculating. Alan Morse was picked up at his hotel 2 miles from the hospital at 11:40 that evening. He had been waiting for David's call. He had his evaluation forms with him. Torres's team documented everything. David remained in the hospital overnight. I sat in his room for an hour while he slept, watching the monitors, watching his chest rise and fall. He looked, in that hospital bed, very much like the boy he had been at 8 years old, before all of this, before whatever combination of pressure and pride and desperation had brought him here. I left before he woke up. The legal process moved quickly, partly because of Torres's existing case, and partly because the evidence we had assembled was comprehensive in a way that did not require much interpretation. Frank's surveillance footage, financial records, The audio from 3 separate conversations recorded in David and Renee's home over the 5 months of investigation. Conversations in which Renee and Alan Morse discussed the evaluation timeline, the guardianship filing strategy, and what they described, in one recording, as the cleanup of the asset structure once control was established. In that same recording, Renee said something about my wife. The forged advance directive was examined by 2 independent forensic document examiners. Both confirmed it was not my signature. The document had been prepared approximately 14 months prior, which matched the period when David's financial situation had become critical and the plan had, apparently, taken its current shape. David was charged with conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse, fraud, and the administration of a controlled substance without consent. Renee faced the same charges with the addition of her documented prior involvement in the 2 earlier cases. Alan Morse faced charges that included 2 counts in the prior cases that Torres had been building for nearly a year. Walter Briggs, the 74-year-old retired engineer who was still living in a facility 40 miles from his home, was not forgotten. His case was reopened as a direct result of the investigation. A guardian ad litem was appointed. The fraudulent competency evaluation was thrown out. Walter was assessed by an independent physician and found to have mild, age-related memory variation that in no way impaired his ability to manage his own affairs. He went home in October. His son-in-law, who had been drawing from Walter's accounts for 8 months, was charged separately. I received a letter from Walter in November. He wrote it by hand, in the careful, deliberate penmanship of someone who had learned to write before computers existed. He said he had been told, more than once, by people he trusted, that his mind was going. He had started to believe it. He had started to feel like a man watching himself disappear. He said that getting home, walking through his own front door, sitting in his own chair, had been the strangest and most overwhelming thing that had happened to him in his 74 years of living. He said he didn't have words for what it felt like to be given back to himself. I keep that letter in the top drawer of my desk. I have read it more times than I can count. David was convicted on all counts. He received 7 years. The judge who presided over his sentencing, a woman I had known for 20 years, read the victim impact statement from Walter Briggs aloud in the courtroom. I was in the gallery. I watched my son sit with his hands folded on the table in front of him, listening to the words of a man whose life had been dismantled by the same scheme David had tried to run on his own father. I have not been able to assess what my son felt in that moment. I spent 34 years reading people in courtrooms, and I cannot read my own son. Renee received 9 years. Her prior involvement in the other cases was treated as an aggravating factor. She showed no visible reaction to her sentence. She was still calculating, I think, still looking for the leverage point, still convinced there was something to be managed. She will spend a long time learning that there isn't. Alan Morse received 14 years. He was 68 years old at sentencing. His attorney argued for leniency on the basis of his age. The judge noted that the victims of his scheme had ranged in age from 66 to 79, and that using age as a shield, when one had made a practice of weaponizing it, struck the court as something less than compelling. David, because he was the only defendant who cooperated fully with prosecutors and provided testimony that helped untangle the financial structure of the scheme, was offered a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. He took it. He testified for 3 days. On the second day of his testimony, he said something that I have thought about many times since. He was asked by the prosecutor why, given that his parents were wealthy and he was their only son and their estate would presumably come to him in time, he had felt it necessary to pursue the plan that led to his arrest. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't think I had time to wait. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I thought about what it means to be in debt so deep that your own father's natural lifespan begins to look like an obstacle. I thought about the distance between the boy who used to fall asleep in the back of my car on long drives and the man who had stood at a champagne table with a sedative in his jacket pocket. I don't have a clean answer. I'm not sure there is one. My daughter Catherine flew in from Seattle the week after the verdict. She stayed for 10 days. She and her mother spent a great deal of time together, and some of it was very hard, and some of it was the kind of talking that needed to happen and had been waiting for a reason to begin. Catherine is 38. She is, by any measure, a good person. She had known that something was wrong between her brother and us, but had not known what. The details were difficult for her. She asked me, on the third day of her visit, sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around a coffee mug, whether I thought David had ever actually loved us, or whether it had always been about what we could provide. I told her I believed he had loved us. I believed he still did, in whatever way remained available to him. I told her that love and betrayal are not, unfortunately, mutually exclusive. People are capable of both simultaneously, and that is one of the hardest things about being a person in a family. She thought about that for a while. Then she said, "How are you not angrier?" I said, "I was angry. I spent about 3 days in February being angry in a way I hadn't been since I was a young man. Then I realized the anger was going to interfere with what I needed to do, so I put it somewhere it wouldn't cost me anything, and I got to work." She shook her head. She said, "You're a strange man, Dad." I said, "Your mother seems to think it evens out. Margaret and I have talked more in the past 4 months than we talked in the 4 years before this. The discovery that David had been planning to remove me from my own life, from my own home, from my own name, hit her differently than it hit me. I had months to absorb it incrementally. She received it all at once, in a hospital waiting room, in a pale blue dress, on her 45th wedding anniversary. She was frightened, not of losing money, not of any practical consequence, but of the particular fear that comes from learning that someone you loved from the moment they were placed in your arms was capable of something like this. She asked me once whether she had missed something, whether there had been signs she should have caught, whether she had failed him somewhere along the way that led to this. I told her that people make choices, that we raise our children and we love them and we do our best, and then they become who they are, and sometimes who they are is not what we hoped for, and that is not a failure of love. It is a fact of other people's freedom. She was quiet for a long time after I said that. Then she said, "I know you're right. I just don't feel it yet." I said, "I know. It takes time. We are managing." That is the honest answer. Some days the house feels wrong without the possibility of our son driving up the driveway, and some days it feels exactly right, and neither of those is the final answer. We are in the middle of a long process that will take years and may never fully resolve. What I know is this: these schemes exist. The people who run them are not strangers who arrive uninvited. They are people already inside your life, people you have built trust with over years, people who have watched you closely enough to know which pressure points are accessible. They do not target the careless or the unaware. They target the trusting. They target the people who believe that love means safety. If you are older, if you have built something over a lifetime, if there are people around you asking questions about your cognitive health, your estate plans, your capacity to manage your own affairs, pay attention to the pattern, not just the questions. Anyone can ask a question. A scheme has a shape. It has escalation. It has urgency. It has a cast of characters who seem to arrive independently, but are connected in ways you have not yet mapped. Trust your instincts. The thing in the room that feels wrong usually is, get help before you need it in a crisis. I am fortunate that I knew Frank Okafor, that I knew Sandra Torres's office, that I had 40 years of professional relationships that gave me access to people who could move quickly. Not everyone has that, but everyone has someone, a lawyer, a doctor who is not connected to the people around you, a friend outside the family who can see what you have grown too close to see clearly. And do not let anyone tell you that being older means being less capable. My son, and the people he aligned himself with, looked at a 71-year-old retired judge and saw a man with diminishing defenses. They saw gray hair and a quiet life and a preference for Sunday mornings on the porch, and they concluded that the instincts that had served me for 3 decades had softened into vulnerability. They were wrong in a way that will cost them years of their lives. I am not telling you this to celebrate that. I find no satisfaction in my son's sentence. I find satisfaction in Walter Briggs going home. I find satisfaction in the 2 families from the prior cases who finally have an accounting of what happened to their parents. I find satisfaction in the knowledge that Alan Morse will not evaluate another elderly person as long as he is in federal custody, which, at his current age, may be for a very long time. The letter from Walter is in my desk drawer. On nights when I am sitting in my study and the house is quiet and I am thinking, which happens more than I would admit publicly, I open the drawer and take it out and read it again. Not because I need the reminder of what this was worth, but because his handwriting, careful and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who was told repeatedly that his mind was failing and who kept writing anyway, is one of the most dignified things I have ever seen. Margaret calls me for dinner. The light through the west window is the particular gold of early evening in November, and the yard is covered with leaves from the oak tree that has been there since before we moved in, and the tire swing is still hanging there, calcified into the bark, going nowhere. I am 71 years old. I spent 34 years on the federal bench. I presided over more trials than I can count with precision, and I remember most of them clearly. I have watched human nature at its worst, and I have, on good days, helped hold some of it accountable. I am still here. I am still standing. And if you or someone you know is being told, slowly and carefully, and by people who claim to care about them, that their mind is slipping, that they need help managing their affairs, that someone else should really be making these decisions, I am asking you, directly, to pay attention. The people who do this are counting on you not to. Don't give them that. Margaret is calling again. Dinner, she says. Come while it's warm. I stand up. My knees remind me of their age, as they do every time. I fold Walter's letter along the same creases it has always had and place it back in the drawer. I close the drawer. I walk toward my wife's voice. The gold light through the window holds for another moment. Then it shifts, the way light always does, into something else, something quieter, something that will still be there tomorrow.